Story 1, The Night Painter. In a remote village surrounded by hills and dense forests, there was an abandoned house no one dared to visit. It had belonged to a man named Alvaro, an eccentric and reclusive painter whose works became the subject of dark legends after his death. Alvaro was known for painting only at night, creating impressive yet deeply disturbing canvases. It was said that his paintings captured the darkest nightmares and fears of people, as if he had the power to see into the shadows of their souls. Alvaro's most enigmatic works were never sold or exhibited. After his death, the house was left untouched, like a mausoleum for his dark talent. The villagers avoided the place, believing that the paintings still held a part of the painter's essence, something that should never be disturbed. Rumors circulated that, at night, the figures in the paintings moved subtly, exchanging glances, as if aware of whoever dared to observe them. Enrique, a young artist seeking inspiration, heard the stories about the house during a visit to the village. Fascinated yet skeptical, he decided to explore the place. He thought the rumors were nothing more than superstitions and hoped to find some forgotten masterpiece of great value. That same night, he gathered his camera and flashlight and set out for the abandoned house, ignoring the warnings of the locals. The house stood on a hilltop covered with gnarled trees, their twisted branches resembling deformed arms. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows and doors. Enrique approached slowly, feeling a slight unease but still motivated by curiosity. The front door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind as if beckoning him to enter. As he crossed the threshold, a chill ran through him, though the night outside was warm. The air inside was dense, carrying a bittersweet scent of old paint and rotting wood. The walls were lined with dusty paintings, depicting scenes straight out of feverish dreams. Faceless creatures emerged from dark forests, and men and women with vacant eyes stared directly at anyone who dared to come near. A shiver ran down Enrique's spine, but he continued exploring, mesmerized by the detail in each painting. Each canvas seemed to tell a different story, yet there was a sinister connection between them. The depicted figures appeared to suffer, their bodies twisted into uncomfortable positions, as if trapped in a moment of eternal agony. Enrique moved the flashlight from painting to painting, studying every detail. He noticed that in some, the figures' eyes were slightly out of focus, as if they were looking at something beyond the frame. Other paintings portrayed surreal landscapes, where the sky was a dark red, and the ground seemed to pulse like living flesh. As Enrique ventured deeper into the house, the silence grew oppressive. The wooden floor creaked under his feet, and every sound seemed amplified by the surrounding darkness. Eventually, he reached what appeared to be the painter's studio. The walls were covered with sketches and unfinished studies, and at the center of the room stood a canvas draped with a cloth. Nearby were brushes stained with dried paint and faded palettes, left untouched as if Alvaro had abandoned his work abruptly. Enrique approached the covered canvas and slowly pulled off the cloth. What he saw left him speechless. It was a self-portrait of Alvaro, but the painter's gaze on the canvas was so intense it felt as if it could pierce the soul of anyone who looked at it. The expression was one of unsettling serenity, as if he held a secret no one else could comprehend. In the background of the painting, indistinct figures shifted within nebulous shadows, their outlines barely defined yet eerily familiar. Suddenly, Enrique felt a presence behind him as though someone was watching. He spun around quickly, but no one was there. The air grew heavier, and he realized something had changed. The figures in the paintings along the walls seemed to have shifted positions. Their gazes, once fixed on the void, now locked onto him, as if he had intruded on a space where he didn't belong. The flashlight in his hand flickered, and Enrique heard a soft rustling sound behind him, like the swish of fabric. When he turned back to Alvaro's self-portrait, he noticed that the painter's expression had changed. The serene gaze had morphed into a subtle, almost imperceptible smile, filled with malice. Enrique's heart pounded in his chest, and he tried to leave the studio, but the door was locked. The sound of brushstrokes echoed through the room, even though he was alone. Enrique looked at the canvas and saw that something was being painted before his very eyes. Slowly, a new figure emerged, a likeness of himself, frozen in the same expression of fear he wore in that moment. The shadows in the background of the painting began to move, inching closer to the self-portrait. Enrique tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. Something cold and skeletal touched his shoulder, and the flashlight flickered again. He heard a soft, distorted laugh, as if it came from every painting in the room at once. The figures on the canvases moved slowly, as if stepping out of the frames into the real world. In the last moment before losing consciousness, Enrique saw his reflection within the newly finished canvas. His face forever frozen in an expression of despair. Then everything went dark. The next morning, villagers ventured up the hill to investigate. They found the front door open and the studio empty. There was no sign of Enrique, but a new painting had appeared among the others. It depicted a young man holding a flashlight, trapped in a dark studio, surrounded by shadows that seemed alive. His expression was one of pure terror. Since then, it is said that anyone passing by the abandoned house at night can hear the faint sound of brushstrokes coming from inside, as if the night painter is still creating new works, eternally waiting for his next victim. Story 2, The House of Lost Voices. In a small, time-forgotten town, there stood an old house known as the House of Lost Voices. It stood alone in the middle of an abandoned field, with silent hallways and dark windows that resembled empty eyes gazing into the distance. The locals avoided talking about the house, but children shared stories of how, at night, voices could be heard coming from within. These were not ordinary voices. They were anguished whispers carrying the weight of a suffering beyond human understanding. Rebecca, a young investigator fascinated by paranormal phenomena, heard the legend while visiting the town to interview its residents. Skeptical but determined, she decided to enter the house, document everything, and prove once and for all that the stories were exaggerated superstitions. That night, armed with her camera and audio recorder, she made her way to the house. The sky was dark with no stars and a thin mist covered the surrounding field. The door to the house was ajar as if waiting for her. As she pushed it open, she felt the cold air inside wrap around her body, like an invisible presence welcoming her. Rebecca switched on her flashlight and began exploring. The walls were covered in torn, faded wallpaper, and the floor creaked beneath her feet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant echo of her footsteps. As she ventured deeper into the hallways, strange things began to happen. Her flashlight flickered intermittently, and she felt a slight pressure in her ears, as though she were submerged underwater. Then she heard the first voice, a faint whisper barely distinguishable, but enough to make her stop in her tracks. "Help us," the voice murmured. Rebecca looked around, trying to locate its source, but there was no one in sight. She turned on the recorder, hoping to capture the sound, and kept moving. The whispers became more frequent, all pleading for help, all sounding desperate and lost. "We are trapped," they said. A chill ran down Rebecca's spine, but she tried to stay calm, convincing herself it could be nothing more than the wind slipping through cracks in the old walls. When she climbed the stairs to the upper floor, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavier, and the silence felt alive, as if the house were listening to her every step. At the top of the stairs, she found a closed door. When she turned the handle, it clicked loudly as though something had been released. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark room dimly lit by her flickering flashlight. At the center of the room was an old chair, and sitting on it was a vintage tape recorder. Rebecca approached, feeling an increasing unease. She pressed play, and from the recorder emerged a disturbing sound, overlapping voices, all begging to be set free. "Please help us. We are trapped here." Rebecca staggered back, her heart racing. Suddenly, the door behind her slammed shut. The flashlight flickered wildly, and the voices on the recorder intensified, as if they were spilling out from the walls. The sound was overwhelming, a mix of screams and whispers, all crying out for rescue. Rebecca frantically tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had trapped her inside. That's when she noticed something terrifying. In the reflection of a dusty mirror on the wall, she saw she was not alone. Figures with contorted faces of agony stood behind her. When she turned around, the room was empty, but the voices continued, now clearer than ever. Panicking, Rebecca pounded on the door, desperate to escape. But something cold and invisible brushed against her shoulder. The voices whispered in her ear, and she realized the house wanted her to stay, to become another lost soul among them. Just as despair threatened to consume her, the door creaked open by itself. Rebecca bolted down the stairs, the whispers still echoing behind her. She fled through the field until she reached the town, where locals found her hours later, trembling and in shock. Since that night, Rebecca has never spoken about what happened in the house. The House of Lost Voices remains standing, silent during the day but alive at night. Some say that if you get close, you can still hear the whispers of those who never left, pleading for freedom. Story 3: The Clock of Frozen Time. In the heart of an antique shop in a coastal city, there was an old clock that caught the attention of everyone who passed by. The clock was magnificent, crafted from darkened bronze, with intricately carved hands and a glass surface that reflected more than just its surroundings. It never showed the correct time, and the second hand remained frozen in the same spot. The shopkeeper, a reserved old man, refused to sell it, claiming that the clock brought misfortune to anyone who dared possess it. Marcos, a collector obsessed with unusual artifacts, paid no attention to the warnings. He insisted until the reluctant shopkeeper agreed to sell it. "Be careful what you wish for," the old man whispered as he handed over the clock. Marcos brought it home, enchanted by its eerie beauty and determined to figure out why it had stopped. That night, as he examined the clock, something strange happened. The hands began to move slowly, as if time itself were being restarted. As they advanced, Marcos felt a strange dizziness, as though the very fabric of time was shifting around him. Objects he was sure he had left in one spot suddenly appeared elsewhere. He began hearing distant voices, echoes of conversations he didn't recall having. The clock, once frozen, now showed a different time every time Marcos glanced at it. And each time he looked, a disorienting sense of déjà vu washed over him, as though he were trapped in an endless loop. Days passed, and Marcos realized that he was no longer in control of his own routine. He woke up in unfamiliar places with no memory of how he had arrived. Hours slipped by in the blink of an eye, and at times, it felt as though he were reliving the same moment over and over again. Desperate, he tried to rid himself of the clock. But no matter how far he threw it away or where he left it, the clock always reappeared in his house, ticking and marking a different hour each time. It was then that Marcos understood the terrifying truth. The clock wasn't merely stopped, it was trapping him in a distorted version of time, an endless cycle with no escape. Now, imprisoned in a loop that never ends, Marcos lives each moment as if it were the first, but with the dreadful feeling that he has experienced it countless times before. And each time he looks at the clock, the hands inch forward, reminding him that he will never escape frozen time. Story 4: The Mirror of Hidden Realities. In the attic of a century-old mansion, long abandoned, lay a dusty mirror hidden among old furniture and forgotten boxes. The mirror had an ornate silver frame, adorned with figures that seemed to shift subtly depending on the viewer's angle. A legend surrounded the mirror, claiming it reflected not only appearances but also revealed the hidden version of people's souls, exposing secrets and dark desires they didn't even know existed. Alicia, an art restorer with a passion for ancient objects, was hired to evaluate the mansion's contents for a future sale. During her inspection of the attic, she found the mirror in a dark corner, partially covered by a cloth. When she removed the covering, she was captivated by the mirror's eerie beauty. Its surface was flawless, but the intricate symbols on the frame seemed alive, each detail whispering of an untold story. Intrigued, Alicia decided to take the mirror home, believing that once restored, it could fetch a fortune at auction. She placed it in her bedroom, ignoring the strange energy it emitted. That night, as she prepared for bed, Alicia passed by the mirror and for a fleeting moment, felt as if her reflection blinked, despite her knowing she hadn't. Uneasy, Alicia turned off the lights and tried to sleep, but her dreams were restless. In her dream, she was trapped inside the mirror, watching her own life unfold from the other side, unable to communicate or escape. In the reflection, her double smiled wickedly, as if content to take her place in the real world. She woke up with a start, covered in cold sweat, and immediately looked toward the mirror. It stood still, but something in the reflection's eyes unsettled her. In the following days, Alicia noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She found herself doing things she didn't remember deciding, as though an invisible force was influencing her actions. Small objects in her house disappeared, only to reappear in odd places as if someone was playing tricks on her. And every time she looked into the mirror, her reflection seemed slightly off, moving with a barely perceptible delay. One night, after another unsettling dream, Alicia decided to investigate the mirror's origins. She discovered that it had belonged to an old family, whose members had mysteriously vanished. According to ancient records, the mirror was believed to be a portal to a parallel dimension, where distorted versions of people awaited the chance to switch places with them. The curse was clear. Once the mirror was used, the exchange became inevitable. Terrified, Alicia tried to dispose of the mirror, but no matter how far she took it, it always reappeared in her bedroom as if bound to her. Desperate, she draped a cloth over it, hoping to block its influence. Yet even with the cloth in place, her reflection still seemed visible, smiling patiently, waiting for the right moment to complete the exchange. On the final night she was seen, Alicia sat in front of the mirror, mumbling incomprehensibly as her reflection watched with a triumphant gaze. When friends arrived to check on her, the mirror fell to the floor, shattering into countless shards. To everyone's horror, Alicia's reflection remained trapped in each fragment, as if waiting patiently for someone to reassemble the pieces. Story 5: The Library of Whispers. In the old town of Campos do Mayo, there stood a forgotten library, its doors sealed shut for decades. Locals believed the library was cursed, a place where the books whispered forbidden secrets, and those who dared to explore them never returned the same. No one knew exactly what transpired inside the dark building, but everyone avoided passing by it, especially at night. Lucio, a literature professor with a fascination for ancient manuscripts, became obsessed with the rumors. Driven by a near-obsessive curiosity, he obtained a copy of the old key and, on a cold winter night, decided to enter the building. When he opened the door, an overwhelming silence greeted him, broken only by the faint sound of pages being turned. The interior of the library was vast and dimly lit. Towering bookshelves stretched toward the ceiling, their spines covered in dust and age. At the center of the room stood a dark wooden table, on which lay a single open book. As Lucio approached it, a faint whisper echoed around him, as though the words on the pages were being read by an unseen voice. The book was written in a language unfamiliar to Lucio, yet somehow he felt he understood every word. The pages contained haunting tales of people lost in time, trapped in endless cycles of suffering. As he read on, the whispers grew louder, filling his mind with disturbing images and memories that didn't belong to him. Suddenly, Lucio felt a presence beside him, as if someone were watching him closely. He looked around, but the room appeared empty. The air became heavier, and he noticed the shadows between the shelves shifting, forming human-like shapes that slithered through the aisles. Terrified, Lucio tried to close the book, but his hands were frozen, as if an invisible force compelled him to keep reading. The whispers now roared in his mind, and Lucio saw with growing horror that the words in the book were changing. They were becoming sentences that revealed his deepest fears and darkest secrets, things he had never shared with anyone. The shadows edged closer with each turn of the page, forcing him deeper into the story. At last, Lucio reached the final page, and the horrifying truth dawned on him. The library wasn't merely a collection of books, it was a portal to a realm where lost souls wandered endlessly, trapped within stories that never ended. As the shadows closed in around him, Lucio realized there was no escape. The next morning, when the library was reopened, Lucio was gone. In his place, the book he had read contained a new story, his own. It described, in chilling detail, his descent into madness and his eternal entrapment within the cursed pages. From that day on, anyone daring to read that book hears Lucio's voice between the lines, begging to be freed. But everyone knows the truth. Whoever opens the book won't just read a story, they will become a part of it forever. Story 6: The Room of Shadows. In the basement of an old abandoned hotel, there was a room no one dared enter. It was known as the Room of Shadows, a place where light never fully penetrated, regardless of the time of day or the strength of the lamps. Those who ventured inside reported feeling an overwhelming cold and the eerie sensation of being watched by something unseen. Anyone who stayed there too long would experience hallucinations, and some never returned at all. Miguel, an urban explorer known for documenting haunted locations, heard the rumors and decided to investigate. Determined to capture footage of the mysterious room, he entered the crumbling hotel on a rainy night, ready to confront whatever lay inside. The entrance was in ruins and the air reeked of mold and decay. The wind howled through broken windows, but Miguel remained undeterred. With a flashlight in hand, he descended the stairs toward the basement, where the legendary room awaited. At the end of the corridor, he found the door to the Room of Shadows. Its wood was old but strangely intact, as though time had failed to wear it down. The metal handle was cold, but it turned effortlessly, and the door creaked open to reveal a darkness so deep that even the beam of his flashlight struggled to cut through it. Miguel stepped inside, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on him from all sides. His flashlight flickered, and as its weak beam swept across the walls, he saw handprints smeared across the surface, marks that looked like desperate scratches. A shiver ran down his spine, but he pressed on, taking photos and recording every detail. Suddenly, his flashlight dimmed, and Miguel heard a faint sound, like something shifting in the shadows. He spun around, trying to locate the source, but there was only darkness. The air grew colder, and he felt something brush past him, like a gust of icy wind. His flashlight flickered again, and then he saw it, shadowy figures shifting along the walls, their shapes vaguely human but with distorted, undefined forms. The figures moved with an unsettling purpose, as though observing his every step. Miguel's heart pounded, but he continued filming, desperate to document the phenomenon. Yet the shadows closed in slowly, tightening their circle around him. Realizing the danger, Miguel tried to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. There was no handle on the inside, and the darkness pressed down on him, suffocating him with its weight. The whispers began, soft, sinister voices echoing in his mind, repeating over and over, "You shouldn't have come here." His flashlight gave out entirely, and Miguel was plunged into complete darkness. He felt cold, unseen hands grip his shoulders and drag him downward. He fought to break free, but it was as if his strength was being drained. The shadows enveloped him, their whispers turning into low, malicious laughter. The last thing Miguel saw before being swallowed by the darkness was a grotesque figure emerging from the wall. Its face was a twisted mask of rage and sorrow. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. The next morning, a group of fellow explorers found Miguel's camera lying outside the hotel, but there was no trace of him. When they reviewed the footage, all they saw was darkness, except for the final moments. Just before the camera shut off, a shadow passed in front of the lens, and a whisper could be heard, "One more for the shadows." Story 7. The Song of the Phantom Valley. In an isolated mountain range, there was a hidden valley that never appeared on maps, and its trails seemed to change according to the whims of nature. The place was known as the Phantom Valley, where ancient travelers swore they had heard a haunting melody played by instruments not of this world. The song was said to lure those who heard it, drawing them toward a dark and unknown fate from which they never returned. Carolina, a musician fascinated by legends, heard the tale while visiting a nearby village. The idea of a mysterious melody emanating from a lost valley intrigued her deeply. Determined to uncover the truth, she set off to explore, carrying only a backpack and a recorder to capture the sound. The trail to the valley was winding and treacherous, with the wind whispering through the trees, carrying fragments of the distant melody. Carolina followed the sound, mesmerized by the melancholic harmony that seemed to speak directly to her soul. When she finally reached the valley, it revealed a landscape of surreal beauty. The grass shimmered with a silver glow, and the air was thick with an indescribable sense of nostalgia. The song echoed throughout the valley, as if the mountains themselves were playing invisible instruments. Carolina activated her recorder and began to search for the source of the sound. As she ventured deeper into the valley, the melody grew clearer, as though guiding her toward something. Suddenly, she stumbled upon a small clearing. In its center stood a circle of ancient stones, and within the circle rested a violin upon a weathered rock. The instrument looked new, as if someone had left it there only recently. Despite the absence of any musicians, the haunting song continued to fill the air. Overcome by curiosity, Carolina picked up the violin and began to play along with the melody. The moment she struck the first note, everything changed. The air grew heavier and a dense fog enveloped the valley. The once beautiful melody transformed into a sorrowful lament. Carolina tried to stop playing, but her fingers moved of their own accord, as if the violin had taken control of her. Shapes began to materialize from the mist, shadowy human figures with blank faces, each playing unseen instruments. Carolina realized with growing horror that these were the lost travelers, their souls trapped in the valley, condemned to perform the same mournful song for eternity. The melody intensified, and she felt her consciousness dissolve into the music, becoming one with it. Days later, a group of hikers found Carolina's backpack and recorder at the entrance to the valley, but she was nowhere to be seen. When they listened to the recording, all they could hear was the same haunting melody, and in the background Carolina's soft voice whispering, "I found the song, and now I am part of it." Story 8. The Doll in the Hallway. In an old house on the outskirts of a small town, there was a porcelain doll tied to eerie events no one could explain. The doll had delicate features, with soft curls and lifelike blue eyes that seemed to follow anyone who passed by. It was always found seated on a rocking chair in the long hallway of the house. No matter how often the family tried to move it, the doll somehow reappeared in the same spot, as if it belonged there. The doll had once belonged to Clara, the daughter of the house's previous owner, who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Anna and her family moved into the house unaware of the doll's unsettling history. On their first day exploring the new home, Anna's young daughter, Sophia, discovered the doll and claimed it as her new friend. Though Anna found the old doll unsettling, she didn't want to frighten her daughter, so she allowed Sophia to keep it. That night, as the family settled into their new home, strange events began to unfold. At midnight, Anna awoke to the faint creaking of the rocking chair coming from the hallway. At first, she dismissed it as the wind, but the sound persisted, slow and deliberate. Feeling uneasy, she got out of bed and went to investigate. When she opened her bedroom door and peered down the dim hallway, there was the doll, gently rocking in the chair. Its blue eyes glinted in the soft light, almost as if it were alive. Disturbed, Anna took the doll and locked it in the basement storage room, hoping that would put an end to the strange occurrences. Relieved, she returned to bed, believing the issue was resolved. But in the dead of night, the sound of the rocking chair returned, louder than before. Anna rushed to the hallway, and to her horror, the doll was back in the chair, staring silently into the darkness as it swayed back and forth. The next morning, Anna tried explaining the strange events to her husband, but he dismissed them as dreams or stress from the mood. However, Sophia had grown quiet and refused to play with the doll anymore. "She's not nice," Sophia whispered to Anna. "She says she wants me to go with her." Determined to understand what was happening, Anna delved into the history of the house. She discovered that Clara, the previous owner's daughter, had claimed the doll could talk and wanted to take her away. Her parents had thought it was just a child's imagination, until the night Clara vanished without a trace. Ever since, the doll had remained in the house, waiting as if it needed another child to bond with. Anna tried to get rid of the doll several times. She threw it away, left it in distant places, and even burned it. But no matter what she did, the doll always reappeared on the same rocking chair in the hallway. And each night, the whispers in the hall grew louder, soft, childlike voices calling Sophia's name, urging her to come play. One night, Anna was jolted awake by a scream. She ran to Sophia's room and found her daughter sitting on the bed, pale and trembling. "She says she's taking me to play forever," Sophia sobbed. "She said I won't come back." Terrified, Anna grabbed the doll and took it deep into the forest, burying it beneath the roots of an ancient tree. The earth felt cold and heavy beneath her hands, as if resisting the burial. With a final shiver, Anna filled the grave, hoping this would finally rid her family of the doll's presence. For a few days the house was quiet. The rocking chair remained still and the whispers ceased. But Anna couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't truly over. A week later, as she was tidying Sophia's room, she found a note tucked under her daughter's pillow. In Sophia's childish handwriting it read, "She says she's not gone. She's waiting. And she's coming back." Since that day, Anna has lived in constant fear, dreading the moment the rocking chair might start creaking again in the dead of night. Every time she walks past the hallway, she can't help but listen, just in case the doll decides it's time to return. Story 9, The Lighthouse of Lost Souls. On a fog-covered coast, an abandoned lighthouse continued to shine, even though no one had maintained it for decades. No one knew who kept the light burning, but fishermen swore it had been guiding ships into peril for years. Local legends claimed that the lighthouse was haunted by the souls of those who had perished in the treacherous waters, forever condemned to guide others toward the same tragic fate. Ricardo, a photographer fascinated by maritime landscapes, decided to capture images of the lighthouse for a new project. He had heard the fishermen's eerie stories, but he was skeptical of ghost tales. Renting a small boat, he set off alone to reach the island where the lighthouse stood. The journey started smoothly, but as Ricardo approached the island, an impenetrable fog rolled in, surrounding his boat and reducing visibility to a few feet. When Ricardo finally reached the dock, a strange heaviness filled the air. The ocean's usual rhythmic waves were oddly muffled, as though the world was holding its breath. He made his way up the winding path toward the lighthouse, its silhouette looming against the gray sky. The front door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing the lighthouse's surprisingly well-preserved interior, with ancient nautical charts lining the walls. In the center of the room sat an old leather-bound journal, its pages open. The entries detailed shipwrecks with unsettling precision, as if the writer had known the doomed vessel's fates in advance. As Ricardo flipped through the pages, a chilling sense of déjà vu crept over him, as though the journal knew he was meant to be there. Suddenly, Ricardo heard the soft echo of footsteps spiraling down the tower's staircase. He called out, but only silence answered. Climbing the steps cautiously, he reached the lantern room at the top, where the lighthouse's beacon spun slowly, cutting through the endless fog. Ricardo gazed out at the sea and froze. Emerging from the mist were shadowy figures, their clothes tattered and faces hollow with sorrow. They staggered along the shoreline, making their way toward the lighthouse with a dreadful inevitability. Ricardo realized they weren't mere phantoms but the souls of those who had drowned in the unforgiving waters, forever drawn back to the beacon that had sealed their fates. Ricardo spun around to flee, but the heavy metal door slammed shut behind him, trapping him inside. As the figures outside began ascending the spiral stairs, the light in the tower whirred faster, and Ricardo heard distant screams carried on the ocean breeze. The souls were returning, and this time they wanted company. The next morning, fishermen found Ricardo's boat drifting aimlessly near the island. There was no sign of him, but his camera lay abandoned at the dock. When the fishermen reviewed the photos, they saw the chilling image of the shadowy figures approaching the lighthouse, their faces twisted in anguish. In the final frame, there was a close-up of Ricardo standing inside the lantern room, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. Below the photo was a hastily scribbled message in the journal. One more soul to light the way. Story 10, The Invisible Guest. There was an old inn on the outskirts of a forgotten road, a place where weary travelers could find rest, but almost no one ever returned to tell their story. Those who did spoke of a disturbing presence, something unseen, always watching them as they slept, as if the inn itself held a spirit that never allowed peace. Renata, a journalist with a passion for mysteries, decided to spend a night at the inn after hearing the eerie rumors. Determined to uncover the truth, she hoped to write a captivating article that would intrigue her readers. She arrived just before dusk, when the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the abandoned road. The innkeeper, a gaunt and silent man, handed her the room key with a thin, unsettling smile. "Not all guests are easy to see," he muttered cryptically, "but they're always nearby." Confused but curious, Renata climbed the creaking stairs to her room. It was a small suite with antique wooden furniture, a large bed, and a tarnished mirror mounted on the wall. The air was unnervingly cold, though the windows were sealed tight, and the silence was so deep it seemed unnatural. Renata tried to brush off the uneasy feeling that settled over her. She unpacked her belongings and prepared for bed, but the sense of being watched gnawed at her. Every time she glanced at the mirror, she swore she saw something shift behind her, just out of sight. She turned abruptly, but the room was empty. Convinced it was only her imagination, she turned off the lights and slid under the heavy quilt, hoping to get some rest. At midnight, Renata was startled awake by the soft sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unnervingly close. Her heart raced as she lay still, listening intently. The steps were light, as if someone, or something, was walking carefully across the room. Holding her breath, she reached for the bedside lamp and flicked it on. The room appeared empty, yet the air felt thicker, as if someone else were there with her. She scanned the mirror, and for a brief moment, she saw movement, a shadow shifting just beyond her reflection. Alarmed, she leaped out of bed and searched the room. Finding nothing, she tried to dismiss the experience, but the mirror's reflection lingered in her mind. When she lay down again, a new terror took hold. The mattress sagged slightly, as though someone had just sat down on the edge of the bed. A chill spread through the room, and Renata could feel the cold pressure of invisible hands on her shoulders. The presence was unmistakable, growing stronger and more invasive with each passing second. Fighting her rising panic, Renata grabbed her camera and began snapping photos in every direction, hoping to capture whatever haunted the room. But as she reviewed the images on her screen, she saw only strange, shifting shadows, blurry outlines of forms that had no place in the real world. Just as she thought she might escape the room's oppressive grip, the door refused to open, as if it had been locked from the inside. The mirror on the wall began to tremble violently, and shapes within it started to take on human form, dark, faceless figures moving toward her reflection. Terrified, Renata approached the mirror, and what she saw chilled her to the bone. Her reflection was no longer her own. Instead, it wore a sinister smile and moved with eerie independence, as though it knew a secret she could never understand. Then the room grew deathly cold, and Renata felt invisible hands pulling her toward the mirror, as if something inside was determined to drag her into its world. She struggled to break free, but the reflection reached out for her, its eyes black and lifeless. Just as she tried to scream, the room was plunged into darkness. The light flickered wildly, and the last thing Renata saw was her reflection disappearing, replaced by a formless shadow that whispered incomprehensible words. When morning came, the innkeeper went to check on Renata's room. He found the door slightly ajar, but the room was empty. Her camera lay abandoned on the bed, its lens cracked. As the innkeeper flipped through the photos, his hands trembled. The final image was of Renata sitting on the bed, smiling, her eyes void of any emotion, dark and hollow. Since that night, travelers who stop at the inn swear they hear faint footsteps in the halls, and some claim they've seen reflections in the mirrors that do not match their movements. For those brave enough to stay, the mirror always seems too lifelike, almost as if it's waiting for its next guest. And that concludes our collection of eerie tales. If you've made it this far, don't forget to smash that like button to support the channel, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next spine-tingling story. See you in the next video.